Hello. Here we will be looking at tone curves within the Develop module in Lightroom. In the Develop module, underneath the Basic panel, you'll see Tone Curve. There are a few different ways to adjust tone curves. One is by simply moving the sliders, either in highlights, lights, darks, or shadows, to the positive or negative. You can see how that affects the tones in the images. For each of those regions. Another way to adjust tone curves is by simply choosing a point in the tone curve. If you hover over this graph, you can see when you're dealing with shadows, darks, lights, or highlights. And you can move the curve just by clicking on it and dragging. Another thing you can do is click on the tiny direct adjustment tool. So if you activate that and then go within the image, you can control, in this case, shadows, because I clicked on a shadow area of the image, or any tonal range that you click on. Right? So here I will show what the image looked like to start and the result. This is a side-by-side before and after comparison of the image. This image also used tone curves to enhance the contrast. I'll just take you through the steps. The lights were brought up 11 points. Dark tones were brought down 12 points. Clarity was raised 57 points. And then vibrance was taken up almost 30 points. In this image, you can see the very dramatic change within contrast in the image. Upon import, the image was quite flat, as is reflected in the histogram. Light tones were brought up 100 points in tone curves. Dark tones also brought up quite a bit, 34 points. Shadow tones were then brought down 34 points. 19 points of clarity were added. Exposure was increased by 0.15 stops. Then 14 points of black clipping were subtracted. In this image, the difference isn't as dramatic as in some of the previous images, but I'll take you through the steps. Some clarity was added. Light tones were brought up. Dark tones were brought up. Shadow tones were reduced. And light tones adjusted a little further up. In this image, the change from before and after is quite dramatic, and this simply used tone curves, bringing light tones up, dark tones down, and ultimately light tones way up. You can see the numbers here. Light tones were plus 79, darks were brought down 11 points. Here as well, the initial image was quite dark, so exposure was adjusted upward, still a bit flat. Some clarity was added. Light tones were brought up. Dark tones were brought down. And light tones adjusted up a bit further. Finally, here's another comparison, predominantly relying on tone curves to increase contrast and reduce flatness within the image. Upon import, the image was slightly flat, was cropped and rotated very slightly. Some clarity was added to bring out the texture. Tiny bit of exposure. Light tones were increased. Dark tones reduced. Vibrance increased. Saturation increased very slightly. Finally, light tones increased a bit more. And exposure increased a bit more. That concludes this discussion of tone curves.